Oh, right. Okay.
The countervailing fact there is it's a beautiful day in town here. So it's,
Yeah.
fair. Okay, well, why don't we get started then? Oh, okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Neil Hibbert, head of the Political Studies Department here at the University of Saskatchewan. And before beginning our evening's proceedings, I would of course like to acknowledge that the University of Saskatchewan is located on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. It would certainly be preferable to be able to gather together, but perhaps a positive element of being remote is that our university's truly global alumni can attend in greater numbers than might be normally possible. We are here because, as most of you know, our guest professor, Professor Jennifer Welsh, holds a BA in 1987 and is a political studies graduate at the University of Saskatchewan and was recognized for an Alumni Achievement Award this year. The Alumni Achievement Award recognizes members of the USask alumni for an outstanding lifetime of accomplishments and contributions to the social, cultural, and economic well-being of society in any area, including academics, arts, private sector contributions. Dr. Welsh's receipt of this award provides us with a wonderful opportunity to hold an event that engages our alumni and our students in scholarship and dialogue. Tonight's event is special in my view because it brings together our alumni with our current faculty and students. And the latter, of course, will, assuming all goes well, be future members of our institution's alumni and will continue our university, the College of Arts and Science, and the Department of Political Studies' proud tradition of producing leaders in the areas recognized by the Alumni Achievement Award itself. So on behalf of the multi-generational community of the Department of Political Studies, the College of Arts and Science, and the University of Saskatchewan, I'm very pleased to welcome you all today. And I look forward to a stimulating discussion of an issue that has certainly dominated all of our lives for the past year and which will have echoes for years to come. Now, before getting started, I need to make a few more introductions. People on the screen here. First, Martin Gall, a political studies instructor, and Cade Broussard, the outgoing president of our Political Studies Student Association, will say a few words about how our Q&A portion will go. They will be followed by Ron Wheeler, Political Studies Emeritus Professor, who will provide a more fulsome introduction to Professor Welsh and her accomplishments that make her the most deserving recipient of the Alumni Achievement Award. So with that, I'll turn it over to Martin Gall.
Excellent, thank you very much. I believe there'll be a slide coming up here just shortly. For those of you who haven't done the Zoom webinar format before, I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction. So thank you for the introduction, Professor Hibbert, and I'm really looking forward to Professor Welsh's talk tonight. As I mentioned to her earlier, we do have a couple of her Massey lectures in my course that I'm teaching right now. I'm sure that you're all as excited as I am for this event. To facilitate the questions in the Zoom webinar format, we don't directly write or type or speak your question to our speakers. Rather, we use the Q&A function. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, if you move your mouse, you'll see a little ribbon pop up at the bottom, and you'll see a Q&A button. If you click that, a dialog box will come up, and you can type your questions into that. Now, you do not have to wait until Professor Welsh's talk is over. You can start to enter your questions right now if you have them. So I would invite you at this moment to open up your Q&A box so that when those questions pop fresh into your mind, you'll be able to not lose them and note them down so that we can have a very interesting academic discussion after the talk. So that's the basic functioning. If you have any questions or issues, you can try to throw that into the Q&A as well, but that kind of negates the purpose if you're having trouble with it. But so far in all the events we've held this year, this has not been a technical problem. So with that, I will pass the floor to Professor Wheeler.
Thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to introduce an outstanding scholar in the field of international human rights who deservedly received an Alumni Achievement Award this year. Jennifer is a former student of the Department of Political Studies, as Neil mentioned. She's a former student of mine and one of the very best that I ever had the good fortune to teach. Following her studies here, Jennifer went to Oxford University with a Rhodes Scholarship where she received an MA and PhD. In a very distinguished career, Professor Welsh has become one of the top scholars and advocates on the global responsibility to protect peoples from genocide, from ethnic cleansing, from other crimes against humanity and injustices. From 2013 to 16, Professor Welsh was special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on the responsibility to protect. And from 2014 to 2019, she guided a project called the Individualization of War at the European University Institute in Florence, where she was professor and chair in international relations. She has a long list of publications and other accomplishments. I wasn't allotted enough time to really do justice to that. Professor Welsh was selected to give the 2016 CBC Massey Lectures, as has already been mentioned, one of which was delivered to a full house at the Broadway Theater in Saskatoon. The lectures were entitled The Return of History, which was the title of her accompanying book. And if I can be allowed to oversimplify a bit, in the Massey Lectures, Professor Welsh refers to Francis Fukuyama's 1992 thesis that we reached the end of history with the triumph of liberal democracy and values. And Jennifer replies that if we did, history is back with a vengeance, as evidenced by the return of barbarism, of mass flight, and of barbarism of all kinds. We're not protecting human values as we were obliged to by the United Nations agreement. In March 2018, Professor Welsh was named Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University, where she also serves as Director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies. Jennifer, you've been a credit to our department and a credit to the university, and we're fortunate to have you as an alumnus. And it's truly a pleasure, personally and professionally, to introduce Professor Jennifer Welsh, who will share with us her thoughts on COVID-19 and international cooperation.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and coming from someone who I learned so much from over the years. As you all know, when you're at a university doing a general degree in arts and science, you're trying to figure out where your passion is. And it was with Professor Wheeler that I first studied international relations and discovered my passion. And it's remained so ever since. And I have him, but also the whole faculty at U of S to thank for my fantastic undergraduate education, that I would do exactly the same way over again if I had the chance. So it's really great to be with you. I'm so sad I'm not in Saskatoon. I would like to be there. Hopefully one day I can come back and visit. The last time I was there, I brought my husband and children who had never been to Saskatoon before. And it was a beautiful summer day on the campus. And I was reminded of just what a wonderful place it is. So I wanted to share with you tonight some reflections on how within international relations we might think about the challenges that COVID-19 has represented. And I was reminded of the strange coupling of that international relations and COVID-19, because so much of what we hear is about public health, is about national politics. And I was reminded how pandemics have played a very marginal role in the way we think about the development of the international system historically. So a colleague once asked me, in any of your courses on international relations around the First World War or into the Second World War or later, did you ever teach about the Spanish influenza, the Spanish flu? And my answer was no. And why is that? Why don't we? Why don't we examine the impacts of pandemics historically and today in as analytical a way as we do with other phenomena? So if anything might shake us out of our slumber with respect to that, I'm sure it will be COVID-19. But I've been co-leading a project out of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has been looking at humanitarian health more generally. But in the course of that, we've also been looking specifically at global cooperation as it pertains to pandemics. So I'll share a few thoughts with you around that. And I'll just find my presentation here. Hopefully you can all see that. So I wanted to just go through a few things with you tonight before I open it up to your questions. Just a little bit of context on where we were before COVID-19. It's hard to even imagine that some days. Secondly, to just identify some of the ways in which cooperation was lacking and some of the impacts of that failure to cooperate. And then lastly, some proposals for reform. So turning to the global health landscape before COVID-19, we had seen from 2010 onward the catalytic effects of other pandemics, particularly forms of cooperation after Ebola in 2014. The UN Security Council at that time repurposed an existing peace operation in West Africa to respond to the threat of Ebola. It declared the Ebola pandemic as a threat to international peace and security, something that the Security Council had never done with a public health emergency. And in addition to that, we saw post-Ebola, but even before Ebola, the incorporation of health into the national security apparatuses of different states. And we saw, particularly post-SARS, the evolution of the World Health Organization towards thinking about pandemic detection and response. We also saw, certainly in the 1990s and 2000s, several innovations in health governance. It was, in retrospect, a kind of golden era of action on global health. There were a lot of new actors, a lot of private-public partnerships, and new policy directives and coalitions around particular diseases and public health goals. So if any of you have read the book by David Held and Tom Hale on global governance, it's a book that's used right now in a lot of courses on global governance. You'll see that they focus on these innovations that were occurring in the 1990s and 2000s. And in some ways, when I reflect back on that, there was actually an opportunity cost to some of those public-private partnerships because they were very niche. They were focused on very specific initiatives that were favored by some donors. They were less focused on critical and structural public health infrastructure that we know today is critical for all kinds of goals, but particularly for pandemic preparedness. But despite what we had seen in the global health landscape, there was still a woeful underfinancing of pandemic preparedness, only a partial implementation of those WHO reforms, and a gradual politicization of public health, particularly with respect to certain countries around certain diseases, and the emergence of sovereignty concerns by states with respect to infectious disease and infectious disease outbreaks. So very briefly, I think it's useful to remind ourselves why there's an imperative to collaborate on what I'll call, for the purposes of tonight, PPR, pandemic preparedness and response. And first, most simply, I think we need to remember that the ties, the interdependence that we have among states today create collective health risks that can't be managed independently. They simply require cooperation and collaboration. Secondly, we can begin to think about pandemic preparedness and response as a kind of global public good. It's something that we would all like, but as with other public goods, it's underfunded and undersupplied, because the incentive is to let others do the work rather to invest before there's really a problem. A third factor that creates the imperative is simply that cooperation, sharing knowledge and expertise, particularly on pathogens and treatments, can actually accelerate progress on different forms of response, particularly treatments. And we've seen this, of course, with remarkable advances in the scientific community, which has cooperated very effectively during COVID-19. And then lastly, there's a sort of spillover, if you will, to cooperation on PPR. And that's by setting rules and standards, states develop a shared understanding of threats and they build trust. So there's broader goods that come from that cooperation. But I also think what we've seen, and this is a theme I want to come back to at the very end of my remarks, is a catch-22 with respect to the way that we frame pandemics. What we've done over the past several years is we've securitized health. And we know that by declaring pandemics a threat, a global threat, we mobilize and we attract resources. But we do some other things at the same time. And any of you in the department or among students who have ever studied securitization theory, you'll be familiar with this. Of course, it prioritizes and elevates, but it also crowds out other things. So we have an excessive focus. Sorry, I keep going back and forth here. We have an excessive focus on diseases affecting the developed world as a result of a security mindset. We have very little investment in health infrastructure. We have instead a prioritization of very immediate surveillance and containment, but we've also placed countries almost on a warlike footing with respect to pandemics. It's interesting that Donald Trump placed a former general in charge of Operation Warp Speed, but even Doug Ford put a former chief of the defense staff of Canada, Rick Hillier, in charge of the preparation of the rollout of vaccines. And then finally, securitization of health crowds out a paradigm of solidarity, of thinking about pandemic and global health not as constituting threats, security threats, but as creating basic human rights needs that all citizens everywhere should be entitled to. So I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind, because for me, over the last few months, I've been really struggling with the pros and cons of this security frame. So what did we see when COVID-19 arrived? We saw that most of the action was predominantly national. There were early calls for solidarity and redistribution and doing things differently, but we saw an incredible gap between words and deeds. We also saw the WHO come under intense pressure, but it also lacked authority and capacity in some crucial areas to mobilize state action. There was a reluctance on the part of states to act transparently, especially in that early phase. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a few moments about the report that came out yesterday by the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response. And it describes February of 2020 as a lost month, the month in which both national governments, but also mechanisms for international cooperation failed to galvanize action in the way that it should have. We quickly saw protectionism and critical supply hoarding. Even states in the European Union were bucking World Trade Organization export ban rules. And we saw a reversion very much to an us first, America first mentality kind of spread around the world. But we also saw something else that I think was interesting. We saw states, particularly democratic states, who had acute fears about their performance legitimacy, which I think is a reflection of weaknesses in democracies today, letting that trump any of their other duties towards global solidarity. So what we saw emerge was what the Munich Security Conference report last year called a polypandemic. We saw the pandemic quickly wipe out development gains. The Gates Foundation report of 6 months ago said we lost 25 years in 25 weeks in terms of development goals. We saw the pandemic exacerbating state fragility. We saw it challenging democratic governance and empowering autocratic regimes. And we also saw it further eroding international cooperation. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem here, that in a sense, growing geopolitical rivalry made the tools we had work less well. At the same time, the pandemic itself worsened geopolitical rivalry, because we saw the US and China essentially using performance on the pandemic as another way to compete over who had the best model. And of course, we saw states engaging in vaccine diplomacy and in efforts to gain soft power through efforts on public health. So what needs fixing? Well, many things. And I won't go through an exhaustive list, but it's clear that there's a huge need to scale up dramatically financial support, not just for immediate relief, but for longer term resilience building. And this goes well beyond emergency aid packages to include a new influx of public and private financing for a variety of goals. And I'll come back to this in a moment. We need increased efforts and new mechanisms to really take prevention seriously. I've worked for many years in atrocity crime prevention. We know that it is extremely difficult to galvanize state leaders around the goal of prevention. They can only be galvanized around crisis response. And so we need changes in health governance, but also trust-based and legitimate kinds of reforms to facilitate cooperation, but also to facilitate something else. And that's really productive policy transfer. So where states are doing things well, that those lessons can be transferred quickly elsewhere. And above all, I think we need a new balance in the relationship between the North and the South. And I'm sorry, these are problematic labels, but they're used here very much as shorthand. Learning from COVID is not a one-way street. It is not about advanced societies transferring what they know and what they have to the developing world. Clearly, wealth has been a very poor predictor of good performance during this pandemic. States of all kinds, states of all income levels have had serious, serious gaps in their infrastructure for responding to the pandemic. But I also say a new relationship here, because I think we need a broader compact to meet security and solidarity goals. If I were advising states in the developing world, and I'm not, I would advise them to be very hard-nosed about the politics of this moment. And the politics are that developed countries, to move forward, need developing states, if we're to avoid a future pandemic, to also strengthen their health systems. And this is a moment in which those developing countries can say, this isn't about just the diseases that you care about. This is about the health needs of all of our citizens. And even today, COVID is not the #1 health concern in some states around the world. And we need to remember that. So let me conclude with sharing some of the proposals from the independent panel that released its report yesterday. This was a panel set up by the WHO last April that was designed to look at pandemic preparedness and response. And I invite you to read the report in full. It had a very distinguished Canadian as a panel member, Joanne Liu, who used to be the president of Médecins Sans Frontières for 6 years and has been a real advocate on humanitarian relief and global public health. So a few recommendations, and then my reflections at the very end on what we need to think about in terms of barriers to implementation. So first, the panel has recommended a global health threats council outside of the WHO. And its purpose is to elevate pandemic preparedness and response to the highest political level. It would be a body composed of leaders from developed and developing countries with civil society representation that could mobilize resources, but that could also hold states accountable for their performance. It's a very bold recommendation. Secondly, it has recommended more funding power and independence for the WHO, dramatically more funding to ensure that the member state fees that currently represent about 20% of its budget come to meet 2/3 of its budget, but also to give it powers of inspection that are pre-negotiated instead of having to gingerly negotiate states for the capacity to survey what's going on in a country with respect to an infectious disease. But also independence. The WHO desperately needs political space to do its work. If you look on paper, the power that it had after 2005, many of the things we would have wanted it to do, it already had, but it deferred politically to its member states. We also, according to the panel, need a new international system for surveillance, validation, and alert to take advantage of the digital tools we have to rapidly mobilize epidemic intelligence that comes not just from governments, but from open sources, and to quickly elevate those into decision-making structures so that we act on the precautionary principle rather than waiting for confirmation, exhaustive evidence, that we act on the precautionary principle in terms of recommending actions for states. They also recommend a separate international pandemic financing facility to fund long-term preparedness and emergency response to the tune of 5 to 10 billion a year for 10 years. It's a lot of money. As I heard Bill Gates say the other day on a webinar, and he talks often in huge sums, he said it's not a lot of money when you think about what we invest in other things and what we have lost in terms of the pandemic. I think the other thing that's important about this recommendation is the intent to try to incentivize transparency on infectious disease so that states are not trying to hide infectious disease for fear of the economic repercussions, but feel because of the funding that's available, they are able to be transparent. And then a last set of recommendations, I think this is extremely interesting. A pre-negotiated and permanent COVAX. Some of you will be familiar with this facility on vaccines that would ensure equitable distribution of diagnostics, of tests, of critical supplies, and of vaccines. So what we would be doing would be moving from what I would call a charity model, where we are donating vaccines to the developing world, to a shared fate model, that we pre-negotiate the equitable distribution of all of these things that we need for pandemics. Fifthly, we need updated national pandemic prevention plans and pandemic coordinators in all member states of the WHO. I don't need to say much more about that. And then finally, a political declaration by states at the upcoming World Health Assembly to support the recommendations of the panel and to pave the way for a special session of the GA and to facilitate the negotiation of a framework convention on pandemic preparedness and response. So these are bold recommendations to seize a moment that is going to be very short. My worry is that populations everywhere are desperate to go back to normal, whatever normal means, and that we lose this moment of intense attention on this issue to make meaningful changes to global cooperation on public health. So what are some of the barriers to implementation? Well, I was taught well by my professors at the University of Saskatchewan. And so I understand the politics of all of this, or at least I think I do. And what the panel has done is it's diagnosed the problem only partially. It's not just about institutional design. It's also about political will and political rivalry, and addressing that as a backdrop to institutional change. So even at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the then Soviet Union agreed to create mechanisms on arms control. But they had to do so in a way that isolated the political dynamics and in some senses turned the spotlight off of them and enabled more track two, behind the scenes kinds of agreements. Secondly, I am very worried about the likelihood of rich countries committing to transparency and inspection. I think this is going to be the toughest nut to crack. We couldn't crack it through the 2005 international health regulations. How will we incentivize states to be transparent? Thirdly, as I alluded to a moment ago, it may be that we need a global health détente, just in the way that we are seeing at the moment a global climate détente prior to the big international agreement. So we see President Biden, despite being very tough with respect to China on some issues, trying to convene the Chinese and others before the Glasgow summit on climate change. Do we need something similar here? And then lastly, it's my final comment, we need to remember the blind spots of the security frame. This is a set of solutions around pandemic preparedness that we are considering because the developed world was affected by this pandemic in a way that it was not affected by previous pandemics. But does that security frame take us away from some of the thinking that we need to do about global health as a global public good, and one in which we have to also import the principle of solidarity? So I'll stop there. I'm delighted to take your questions. This is just a set of reflections. I haven't written this up yet in any form. I'm still thinking about how to do so. So I would be really keen to hear your thoughts and reactions and what you're thinking about as you look at problems of global cooperation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Welsh. That was an awesome bird's eye view of COVID and IR and global politics. All those pieces plugged in an amazing way. In fact, I had a bunch of questions I was planning to ask, and then I had to strike them off as you were talking, because you kind of hit almost all the main points that I was thinking about. So we're now going to move to the participatory section of our talk tonight. And so I would invite you to type your questions into the Q&A. We already have a couple that have popped up, which is always a good sign. And we'll be able to ask Professor Welsh maybe to build on some of those points that she introduced. And I have a couple that I may abuse my position to ask in a moment as well. But before we go to the questions, and while I wait for our attendees to put the questions into the chat, Kay Brossart, who's the outgoing president of the Political Studies Student Association, has also prepared some questions in advance. So I will turn it over to Kay to ask the first question.
Thank you, Professor Gall, and thank you, Professor Welsh. That was a wonderful presentation, and it's great to see. It's a great example for, I know lots of students are on tonight, to see a former University of Saskatchewan student doing some wonderful work. So our first question comes from Darian, and he's asked, has the COVID-19 pandemic altered the prospects for cooperation in the future between states on global issues? So more specifically, will the so-called vaccine nationalism exhibited early on by the United States and the European Union impact how countries cooperate in the future?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think it is really important not to minimize the degree of failure by established democracies, not just to address the pandemic in their own countries, but to show leadership and solidarity and to act on the logic of a pandemic, which is that until it is solved everywhere, it's not fully solved anywhere. And so that when we think about, I think this really, your question, I could answer at two levels. So I think there's been damage done among advanced states themselves, a great deal of frustration about the way that countries shared supplies or shared vaccines. For example, the most glaring example, the UK and the European Union. I mean, how low can it get? The nature of the mutual recrimination over vaccines was really quite astonishing. But then when you take it more broadly to think about cooperating globally, I think a lot of goodwill has been lost. And we see this being played very effectively by countries who want to extend their influence. So Russia and China have been, at least in the Chinese case, extremely generous with their vaccine. In some cases, they have given vaccines freely, in other cases, not freely. But vaccine diplomacy, aside from vaccine nationalism, has actually been a very, very prominent tool. And so my own view on this is that I think it's very important for a set of advanced democracies, whether or not we can get complete agreement multilaterally, to first act themselves. So if we cannot get this pre-negotiated platform off the ground among all 190 odd states of the international system, if we could get it off the ground with a set of advanced states to make this a permanent mechanism, I think that would help to repair some of the damage. But I think it's been really profound. I also think, just to add to the question, it has made it tougher to see progress on other issues. So if you compare the UN Security Council in 2014 and 2020, you see that while it acted on Ebola, and there are, of course, it was a different infectious disease, it acted quite quickly. It took months to even have a discussion on COVID-19. And it didn't support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire during the pandemic. And so, and part of the reason for that was the mutual recrimination over the pandemic itself. You couldn't pass a resolution in the Security Council because for a time the US insisted on calling it the Wuhan virus. So, you never got anywhere. That's changed somewhat. But I think these institutions have taken a real beating, and therefore they require some significant reinvestment.
Wonderful. I see we have questions coming in the Q&A. I'm going to do one more pre-prepared question, and then we'll jump over to the live questions. So our next one kind of builds on the answer there because it's looking at global issues. And so Joel asks, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that cooperation between states can become complicated during times of crises. Are there any lessons surrounding cooperation that can be learned from the pandemic and applied to other global issues, specifically such as fighting climate change?
Yeah, great question. And I would say we also have to think about it the other way. So one of the things that I've been doing with my project with the American Academy is learning from other existential threats, like nuclear weapons, like chemical weapons, like environmental degradation, on how do you have effective forms of cooperation. So for example, there is a reasonably effective inspection regime for chemical weapons. It doesn't work perfectly, but it is reasonably effective. And in the case, at least of Syria, we saw it able to attribute attacks to specific actors, no matter how contentious that was. And so I think there's important lessons to be drawn, but there's also a need to recognize and this is where I think as analysts, as political scientists, we can be helpful, is to analyze the particular nature of all of these threats. So pandemics are different from the threat of nuclear weapons. They're both existential to a certain extent, but they're different. It's much more slow moving. It hits different places at different times. It requires action in terms of response by multitudes. I mean, if you think about, and part of this, the reason for this is historic. When you think about the cooperation that happened in nuclear arms control, there was a very small elite set of scientists and policymakers who could, within a relatively confined environment, make agreements. Global health is very different. It is so open. Information is so widely available. The scientific community is much larger. So I think with all of these, we have to really analyze the different nature of the threats. I think with respect to the question around climate change, I think there are things that we can learn. I think one of the aspects of the Paris Agreement that I've come to think is very powerful is the notion of targets and peer review. And so that you set targets, but you have a pre-negotiated process for reviewing and disclosing your progress towards them. And this is done in a way that involves multiple actors. The other thing about the Paris process, of course, was that Ban Ki-moon insisted that cities, that civil society, that business be part of that process, not just sovereign states. And so I think there are things that can be learned. I've been thinking a lot too, and I don't know where I've gotten to, on the precautionary principle with respect to climate change and global public health. we're not really successfully applying the precautionary principle on climate change, and nor have we on global public health. But I think these are the questions that we need to ask, and think really creatively about what kinds of lessons travel and what don't.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've actually had a few questions come in on the Q&A here. I'm going to parse a few of them. So Kathy Sutherland asked, the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines was the result of an incredible amount of collaboration and sharing of information among nations, particularly that scientific epistemic community. Are we likely to be able to harness this goodwill and commitment to work together for a goal to other issues facing us, like climate change, in societies where some of us have done well and others have been forgotten and left behind? So I think that part of that question is that equity aspect, and that you spoke about that global north-south divide.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question, because one of the things we need to remind ourselves of is that rather than tarring this episode as one in which cooperation failed across the board, to remind ourselves where cooperation worked. The scientific sharing of information, I know you have fantastic epidemiologists and virologists. In fact, one of them I was reading from University of Saskatchewan yesterday. She was responding to the panel report. You know, the genetic sequencing data was almost instantly shared. And so that kind of transparency among scientists and collaboration, I do think that some of this can be harnessed. I think there's going to be advancements in treatments and vaccines that we can also learn how to respond to other threats to humans and animals, which are only going to increase. So I do think there is some potential there, but the underlying dynamic of the pandemic, which has really been to expose inequity, not to create it. It's exacerbated, but it's also exposed for many of us the depth of inequality in advanced societies and in less developed societies. So the fear, people talk about different letters to describe the pandemic economic recovery. Will it be V? Will it be a V shape? In some ways, it's like a K shape. Those who were already doing well may end up doing better, and those who were doing poorly are going to do even worse. And that, I think, is the challenge of this moment, is to ensure that there is a principle of equity in the recovery. And for me, that means taking this discussion with respect to developing countries out of an ODA development assistance framework. This can't be done as aid. This can't be done as development assistance. The sums of money are simply too great, but also it doesn't conform to the logic that we now need robust public health infrastructure around the world to be able to protect our populations from pandemics, but also from other threats to their human rights. And as I said, I think this is a moment where certain countries can monopolize on that fact to hopefully garner more resources for that task. So I'm not as hopeful as I really, as at heart as I sound. I do recognize that there are barriers, but I think if any moment might provide some momentum around that, it's hopefully this one.
Perfect. We actually have a question from Professor Wheeler. I will turn the microphone over to him.
Thanks, Martin. Jennifer, as you know, morality has always been most difficult in conditions of scarcity. And when Western developed countries began developing vaccines, they were under tremendous pressure from their citizens to get as much vaccine and distribute it as widely at home as possible. Do you think citizens or governments would be different in a future pandemic as a result of international agreements reached after this one? That is, will governments ever let their own citizens die so that other peoples can live? And I guess I'm thinking in terms of development issues in the past. What Western developed countries were asked to do was to tighten their belts slightly so that peoples in the developing world could live and enjoy some of the benefits of a normal kind of life. Here, we might be asking Western developed countries to let some of their people die so that conditions could be improved in the third world. And I wonder if that isn't an important difference between our previous concerns and what a pandemic produces in the way of morality.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we should assume that they would behave differently in a future pandemic. I think citizens' expectations of their government, and that's what I was sort of alluding to with the performance legitimacy concerns, also because of the frailty of democracies generally, that they had to be seen as absolutely delivering for their populations. But that doesn't mean we can't create a mechanism that will make important treatments and capability available to other parts of the world, right? So I don't know all of the details of the AstraZeneca development, but I think that one thing that is interesting about it, which shows that it can be done differently. The United States invested in Operation Warp Speed for the production of vaccines for the United States. And it invested, as we know, huge amounts of money. The Oxford AstraZeneca program also included the possibilities for manufacture and distribution elsewhere in the original agreement. So it is possible, and I'd invite you to try to learn more about that, because I think, and as I say, I wish I knew the details better of how it was done. But I think it is important for us to recognize that difference, because when you look at the recommendation of the panel for this pre-negotiated platform, it is about, and this is also partly, I think, behind Joe Biden's moves to try to waive patents and intellectual property, is we have to make a pre-commitment and put things in place that will enable these kinds of treatments to be produced in other countries and available. That much we can do. But no, at the end of the day, I think the behavior will be the same. But that part, I think, can be different next time. And it must be different. And that's where I would be betting on trying to really create some agreements that lock in some of that shared knowledge and shared capability. It won't create a perfect system that will be completely equitable, but it'll be much more equitable than what we've seen.
Thanks.
I actually just want to ask a quick question that ties in the previous two questions and a bit of your talk. You've mentioned that the Global South should be a bit hard-nosed when it comes up to dealing with access to vaccine and how protection in the Global South protects the Global North. So if you were advising a state in the Global South, what type of things would you be suggesting in terms of them being hard-nosed?
Well, I'm thinking of it in terms of the financing facility and the agreement, for example, if this is going to be led by the G20 or any other body, that when there are demands made for national pandemic preparedness in all states, for example, which of course is being discussed, that every state should have a coordinator, that every state should have a pandemic plan, that it should run simulations, that it should be ready, that there is, and that's going to take funding. And I think that's what the International Pandemic Facility funding facility is going to be for, is to create that, that there at the same time is a demand for funding to help support public health infrastructures more broadly. So that we do not have simply resources that are directed at the concerns of the developed world, which is, through the public-private partnerships we saw, whether it's the Global Fund for TB, malaria, these were extremely important, but they were driven by particular donor interests. And when you look at the broader infrastructure that we now know needs to be in place everywhere, I think this is a moment to try to tie those together and to, when they come to the table, because they will be asked as part of any reforms to show what they're doing on pandemic preparedness. And that's going to require financial help. So that's kind of what I had in mind. It's using this particular moment to also galvanize support for their broader public health needs.
Thank you very much. We have actually a greeting from Curtis Borsaw, political studies student from 1987, says hello.
Oh,
and
yes, I remember. Yes.
And he asks, are you observing any early indications from the US president that he'll have more respect for the role of the WHO and international institutions in general, like the UN? And maybe even we could expand that to include China, because I know China and SARS was a bit of a touchy subject. So do you see that these leading states will have more respect for the role of the WHO?
So I think, yes, there is going to be greater, from what I see, there is going to be much greater support for the WHO from the Biden administration. Re-engaging, participating, perhaps even leading in discussions around buttressing its funding. But I think we should remember that the US's ambivalence towards international institutions and multilateralism predates the Trump administration. It has been a supporter of multilateralism, but also one that wants to be unconstrained by multilateral rules at the same time. And I do think whether it's Buy America or whether it's other agenda items of the Biden administration, there still is going to be a demand, and it comes partly from a perception of what is wanted in terms of domestic politics, that US foreign policy has to work for the American middle class. And in fact, that's what Joe Biden has said, that our foreign policy needs to work for the American middle class, which I think is a really striking formulation. And it's very, it's very 2021, recognizing that that is, where Donald Trump really hit very hard in saying that, that class has been left behind through a kind of zero-sum logic, that any jobs that went to China, ergo came from the United States. So I think we should be very welcoming of its re-engagement. I think particularly with the WHO, it will be more supportive, but it isn't completely unproblematic. And I would also say, with respect to this, that on China, there is a seems to be today a bipartisan consensus in the United States about China as the greatest competitor for the United States, very hard hitting on China's human rights record, but also on a number of other elements. And so I think the US and China relationship is going to remain very tense, and the rivalry is going to remain very heightened. What we will see is probably more skillful behind the scenes diplomacy. But if you watch that exchange in Alaska between US officials and Chinese officials a month or so ago, that was a pretty rough exchange. And that shows you the degree to which this runs deep in the Biden administration. And I'm actually quite struck by also the stance of a variety of think tanks. So they are, if they're not calling it a Cold War, they are certainly seeing themselves in a very long-term game of strategic competition with China, which is going to play out in these institutions. And we see it play out in the UN Security Council. There are issues on which there cannot be engagement, Myanmar being one of them, because of China's interests. And that extends to other issues. So it's by no means a rosy future, but it's one in which at least the US, particularly in New York, is much more engaged through traditional diplomacy and is much more constructive.
And just building on that really briefly, you mentioned earlier about China and Russia using vaccine diplomacy, and that kind of mirrors some of the trade programs where they were more bilateral. Do you think that they are going to play nice or play a more influential role in the WHO?
I think they already do. So I think it's not a question of more influence. I think they already do. And I also think when we read this report, there's a number of the recommendations that really suggest that they're planning for a pandemic that will not originate in China. Because if you think about, for example, the International Financial Facility, to try to incentivize governments to be transparent because of the economic costs of indicating they have an infectious disease, China really didn't need that economic insurance, right? Maybe another country would, but that wasn't the issue here, right? And China will be reluctant, as will I think other states, to pre-negotiated inspections. So there's a sense in which some of these reform ideas have been around for a long time, but we need to make sure we're diagnosing what really went wrong. And there was clearly a period from late December to late January. I invite you to read the report on this, where there needed to be a much earlier indication of a potential pandemic, much quicker action on public health measures by a number of states, and not just the Chinese. So I think their influence is already quite high. And by the way, the influence of China in the UN system has grown enormously over the last decade. It's a participant in peace operations. Its nationals hold very important roles. Its general model, one of my Oxford colleagues, Rosemary Foote, has written a fantastic book about this called China, the UN, and Human Protection, where she says China has a triadic model of strong state, social stability, and economic development. Economic development before rights. And that model has become very influential to a number of states. And it has had an effect on a number of agendas, including the one that I worked on for a very long time. I mean, China has redefined the norm of the responsibility to protect for itself in a way that is about creating strong states that can protect their own populations. And that is not the entire content of that norm. So I think we have to recognize, I think this discourse of whether China will become more influential, as I see it, it already is hugely influential. And that I think is something, we know it economically, but I think we fail to acknowledge how it is true diplomatically and in international institutions today.
Excellent. I know we're a little over time. I have 2 questions left in our Q&A, if you wouldn't mind addressing those. And if we have a moment, I thought we'd close with one last question from students. So 3, and then we'll be out, I promise. So Kathy Sutherland, again, had a second question. And she asked, any suggestions as to how we as individuals can ensure that the lessons we have learned from COVID-19 are acted on by our politicians?
Yeah, fantastic. I think there are lessons, right? I think there are lessons about democratic engagement. I think this pandemic has reminded us how much politics matters. It's mattered profoundly who the political leaders of different countries have been. And different political leaders have responded more or less well. Just Exhibit A, Brazil, where a political leader denied the pandemic and engaged in actions that were hugely costly for his population. And, you know, if I may say something controversial to students, I really applaud your activism on a number of fronts. But you need to be active in democratic politics because politics matters both nationally, but I think it also matters internationally. And I think it's reminded us of that. And also holding our governments accountable. I think some of the information that's come out from the, it's not called a commission of inquiry, I've got the language wrong, but the assessment that's going on about Canada's own response in the early part of the pandemic has been deeply troubling. And there needs to be accountability for that. And I think as citizens, we have to work the channels that we have. So I think there's a lot to be learned on that front, including engaging with the global networks that we have to support people who are going to continue to suffer over the next 6 to 18 months.
Perfect. I'm going to paraphrase this. It's more of a comment, and we're going to kind of phrase it as a question from Gary Gehring. When thinking about the funding model, there should be a mechanism which takes the final product of vaccines, mostly publicly funded, where the wealth creation appears to be held by the vaccine producers. So I think this comment, which could be turned into a question, is thinking that if the vaccines are being publicly funded, how do we address a pandemic where the producers are trying to maximize or attain their profit?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to say something else controversial. I think I do not understand the economic model for vaccine development well enough, and I'm going to do my homework when this is over. But there's been moments in the last 6 months where I wonder what Churchill or what Roosevelt or what other wartime leaders would have been saying to these pharmaceutical companies. And even if we take the moment of the financial crisis, where Joe Biden, when he was in a vice presidential role, essentially said to Lehman Brothers and others, you told us that we can't take you over. Well, you know what? We actually can. And I have been amazed at the meekness with which political leaders have engaged with these vaccine producers, particularly in Europe, in terms of their production decisions. Now, again, I say this, I'm not an economist, I'm not a public health researcher, but I do think there's been political meekness. And there was a comment that I saw the other day where a CEO of a vaccine producer called some of the measures that the Biden administration was thinking about as Marxist East German planning. And I looked at that comment and said, no, this is about a publicly funded product that is essential for human life. You're going to get your money, right? You're going to get your money. Don't worry about that. But also there has to be production and exchange that is going to reach the masses and quickly. And I have to believe that both of those goals still could have been achieved. But I'm going to probably still be scratching my head for a while. But I think there's been a lot of meekness on the part of political leaders on this front.
Excellent. I love that answer. I'll maybe turn to Kate if we have one more question to come from students, and then we will conclude after that.
For sure. So our last one goes back. We were talking about equity before, so it ends on that theme. So it asks, can the COVAX initiative be seen as a sign of process towards greater global equity, or is it more simply symbolic?
You know, so there were clearly issues with its design that were hardwired. It had, the involvement of wealthy countries were paying into it, could take out of it. Canada did so very controversially, even though it was written into the agreement that it was fine for us to do so. But as Professor Wheeler suggested, it did so when we had clear evidence that that we had overbought for our population. So yeah, technically required, but boy, does that look bad, right? On the part of an advanced democracy. I think what was impressive about it were two things. Firstly, that you had, and I was in a discussion around this today, the major global health players sitting around and expending an enormous amount of their time last April foreseeing that there was going to be an equitable distribution problem and kickstarting a process that would put something in place. And that makes me very hopeful that there was that foresight and there was that time commitment early on. I also think that it has been a step that's allowed us to now reflect on what kind of a pre-negotiated system would we want and for what kinds of things. For clinical trials, for diagnostics, for vaccines, probably for critical supplies. And so it has, I think, instigated some productive thinking that I predict will have some good results. So it hasn't been a perfect instrument. And it's been too much on what, Joanne Liu calls it, the charity model, right? Rather than really making it a collective effort for pandemic preparedness for the future. So I'm on balance optimistic that it can be learned from going forward.
Thank you very much. So I know we've abused our time here a little bit, but I'd like to thank you very much. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that the talk and the Q&A provided a lot to think about. In fact, I now apparently have a report that I need to read that wasn't on my list for this week, but it sounds like it'll be fascinating. So on behalf of the Department of Political Studies, the Arts and Science Alumni Office, and the college, I'd like to once again offer our sincere thanks for coming and speaking with us tonight. It's these type of talks that really provide enrichment for our students, connections with our alumni, and just generally building community, which I think is very important. I'd also like to thank the Alumni Association and especially Therese Coleman for setting this up, as well as the Department of Political Studies for organizing tonight's event. And so with that, I would just like to say a heartfelt thank you. It was a great talk, and I hope perhaps you'll be able to come back and speak with us again in the not so distant future, perhaps in person after we all get our double vaccines.
I hope so. Thank you. And in the meantime, I have my fantastic piece of U of S Greystone on my bookshelf here, which you sent to me. And thank you so much for that. I love it. And it's right behind me. So even though I couldn't be there, I have a piece of the university in my little home office where, like all of you, I've been literally living for the past 14 months. So I'm impressed you all stayed on Zoom this long. It was great to be with you. I hope we can talk again.
Thank you very much. And so with that, I will close tonight's event. I look forward to you joining us for events next term. We actually will be having an event coming up on May 22nd with ISAC about the Myanmar event. So please stay tuned for that. And just stay safe and have a great night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks so much. Take care.
There has to be a better way to close Zoom events.
There couldn't be a worse.